Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining tonight. We're going to wait just probably one more minute and then go ahead and get started. Awesome. Looks like people are steadily streaming into the webcast, so I'll go ahead and get started with my introduction. Thank you all again for joining us today for the comeback of Nature's Fastest Animal webcast. My name is Allie Fisher, and I'll be your MC for tonight. I'm the Wildlife and Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Associate for Oregon Wild, and tonight I'm really honored to introduce our guest. Bob Salinger is the Urban Conservation Director for Willamette Riverkeeper and was the former Conservation Director for Portland Audubon, working for the organization for 30 years as an advocate, naturalist, wildlife researcher, and wildlife rehabber. He has been a key figure in monitoring Oregon's peregrine falcons, so I'm really excited to learn more from him tonight. I would also like to offer gratitude to the land itself tonight and for those who have lived here in Oregon since time immemorial. I would like to acknowledge the continuing presence of Indigenous people on the land today. The history of tribes in Oregon is complex and nuanced, and that includes colonial legacies and wrongdoings like forced removal that have had long-lasting and current impacts. It is important to not only acknowledge Indigenous people and the land, but to continue to do meaningful work by supporting them in the present, respecting and uplifting tribal sovereignty and taking action. Additionally, our raffle is still open, but it will be closed tomorrow morning, so make sure to buy those tickets if you're interested in the prizes that we have. And a recording of this program will be emailed out next week and will be posted on our website, OregonWild.org, and our Wild blog. Lastly, please enter your questions at any time during the webcast in the Q&A section. We usually get a flood of questions towards the end of the presentation, so the sooner you can get your questions in, the easier it will be for me to organize and for Bob to answer them once he has finished presenting. Lastly, don't forget to RSVP for our December 13th presentation with renowned author Terry Tempest Williams and talented illustrator Alan Crawford. We're really excited for this one. Join these incredible creators for a profound discussion on the importance of the Endangered Species Act and how we can help protect countless species nationwide. The inspiring, persevering, and hopeful journeys of wildlife pollinators and plants will come alive during this event with beautiful artwork, as you can see from this slide, and heartfelt storytelling. So I hope you all can join us for that one too. And without further ado, I will pass it off to Bob.
Well, great. Good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. And let me get my screen going and we will head out. There it is. Is that showing up, Allie?
Yep, it's looking good. Looks like It's on the last slide, or maybe that's the first. Anyway, I can see it.
Well, again, good evening. My name is Bob Salinger, and as Allie noted, I've been working on bird conservation in Oregon for about 30 years, most of that for Portland Audubon, and I moved over to Willamette Riverkeeper, where I still have the good fortune of being able to work on peregrines. And one of the threads throughout my entire career has been peregrine falcons. I've worked on bird issues across the entire state, but one of the threads that has been a constant has been peregrine falcons. And so tonight we're going to talk about this amazing bird, the fastest animal on Earth, and its journey from the brink of extinction back to recovery. And it's a pretty amazing story, and it's a pretty amazing bird. And some of this, I'm sure some of you know, but I'm going to go through it for those that don't. Peregrines are the fastest animal on Earth. They dive at speeds of over 200 miles per hour. And they are found on every continent except for Antarctica, so they're very, very widespread. Peregrine means wanderer. And some peregrines do incredible migrations from the subarctic all the way down to Argentina. Other peregrines are more stationary and stay in the same areas year round. As you tend to get toward the milder climates, they tend to stay year round. They hunt primarily birds, and they'll take species as small as hummingbirds and as large as Aleutian Canada geese. And what they'll do is they'll come screaming down out of the sky in what is called a stoop or a dive, and slam into their prey. They have what is called a tomial tooth on their beak, and oftentimes they'll just reach down if the bird's not dead on contact and notch the vertebrae. They nest in some of the remotest places on Earth, but they also nest in anthropogenic environments, human-built environments, and there's records dating back to ancient times of peregrines on pyramids and peregrines on cathedrals. And so this is a bird that is closely associated with people as well as a symbol of true wild. And I think that makes it incredibly fascinating. It's a species that has long been valued by people, primarily for falconry. It was used in the Middle Ages and to today for falconry, the sport of hunting with hawks and falcons. And because they are very adaptable to being in human environments and being around humans, they tend to tame down quickly. They were the bird of nobility. They were the birds that kings and queens would hunt with. So there's this incredibly fascinating history that goes back millennia with this bird. Peregrines are called duckhawks, in part because they eat ducks, but also great-footed falcons. And when you look at a peregrine, one of the things you notice very quickly on adults is those big, big yellow feet. And it's funny because I often get people calling me about peregrines. They saw a peregrine in their yard, or they saw a peregrine that was injured and they want me to come take care of it. But one of the ways I often know if it's truly a peregrine, peregrine's been in the news so much that oftentimes any bird that people see is a peregrine. But peregrines have been in the news so much that people associate a lot of raptors as being peregrines. But when I hear big yellow feet, that sets my alarm bells off, and I know that's one that I need to go out and really check on because it probably is a peregrine, and you get a good look at those feet there. You also get a good look at the ferocity. This picture was taken on Portland's Fremont Bridge, and the peregrine's coming at us as we're banding its youngsters, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. And so this incredible species, the fastest species on the planet, this animal that we've had a relationship with centuries and centuries, and this true symbol of the wild, this wildest of birds, almost disappeared. We almost lost them. They almost went extinct. And part of what we're doing here tonight is celebrating the Endangered Species Act, the 50th anniversary of this incredible law that was signed under the Nixon administration. So we're going to walk through that incredible recovery and the role that law played. So this is a success story. This is a story of successfully recovering a species. It has a happy ending. It's actually a tale of two Endangered Species Acts. We're going to talk a little bit tonight about the Federal Endangered Species Act, which is having its 50th anniversary, but also Oregon's State Endangered Species Act, which oftentimes people aren't even aware exists. It's a conservation effort that spans urban, rural, and wild landscapes. And I think as we start to think about conservation of birds, we've really got to think about all of those landscapes, because if we're going to save wild birds, and while peregrines are a success story, our birds are truly in trouble, we've got to think about how we conserve them on all three of those kinds of landscapes. It's also a relatively simple species to recover. And I'm going to talk a lot about the complexities that we faced in the work that we did. But the truth is, relative to a lot of other species that have been listed, the peregrines were a relatively straightforward species to bring back from the brink of extinction. So a little bit about peregrine nesting. Peregrines typically nest on really, really high cliffs. In the subarctic, they'll nest on the ground, but typically they will nest on high cliffs. And what they look for are ledges, high inaccessible ledges that will protect them from predators, ground predators. And that's where they'll have their young. This is a picture of Madrone Wall, which is a popular climbing spot in Oregon. And the peregrine nest, if you can see my pointer, is right here. Back a sec here. And a peregrine nest is called an eyrie. This is a little bit closer, and this gives you a sense of this size of this nest. Peregrines do not build a stick nest. They lay their eggs right on the ledge in either sand or gravel that is built up there. And they will not bring sticks into their nest at all. This is a particularly large nest. This is huge. And you can see two juvenile peregrines. They're close to fledgling here. They're basically doing what peregrines do as they get toward the point where they're going to fledge or fly. They start to come to the edges, they flap their wings, they build up their strength, and eventually they get airborne. One thing that's going to be really important to note as we go through this is we're going to talk a lot about urban peregrines because that's where I've spent most of my career working. But these cliffs protect peregrines not only from predators, but also when they nest on a cliff, there is an updraft. The air rises in front of cliffs. And so what happens is as these peregrines are building up their strength and they're flapping their wings and they're sort of practicing, typically the updrafts keep them on the ledge until they're truly ready to fly. If they do go off the ledge prematurely, they will typically go to a ledge further down. There's places for them to land, so they don't wind up on the ground before they can fly. It's a very different situation in urban environments. And this is a picture of a peregrine scrape, three of them actually. And you can see this peregrine that's looking at the camera. Its head's kind of cocked upside down. She's incubating eggs, and that's her nest. So again, no sticks, just sand and gravel. Peregrine nests, the one I showed you was huge, but oftentimes they're very small, not more than a couple of feet. The situation is very, very different in an urban environment. And peregrines, as I mentioned, have a history of nesting on man-made structures, again, pyramids, cathedrals. And peregrines, once they occupy a site, tend to stay there for pretty much in perpetuity. They pair up. The male is smaller than the female. The male is called a tercel. Tercel means a third, and the male is a third smaller than a female. If you want to think about size, the female is about the size of a raven, a male is about the size of a crow. But they also have been known to substitute man-made structures for natural cliff sites. And many human structures have the same kinds of attributes as a wild cliff site. This is a pictures I took on the interstate bridge from Portland to Vancouver. And this is kind of what you might see in an urban environment. Buildings have ledges, cliffs have ledges. In this case, if you look at the right-hand side, this is the lift block. Peregrine sitting right here. There are two eggs. That is the lift block on the interstate bridge. It's a 1 million pound block, and that's what raises and lowers the bridge. And peregrines have nested on there now for the better part of 2 decades. And they would ride those lift spans up and down while they were incubating their eggs and raising young. So every time the bridge went up and down, the peregrines would go up and down with them. But for them, this was functionally a cliff. And there's things that draw them to urban environments. There's a really great prey base. Most of these sites have a lot of pigeons, a lot of starlings. In fact, there have been studies on peregrines that show that when they nest in urban environments, they tend to have to go a much shorter distance for food when they're hunting. They'll stay closer to the nest because there's food very close by. I've actually seen peregrines on urban nest sites take prey by going into pigeon nests. You'll see them go in, grab a young pigeon, and then leave. They always look really embarrassed when they do that. You know, it's kind of not appropriate for a peregrine, this fast, amazing species. They can dive at 200 miles an hour, that they go into these nests and just kind of pick out the young. And so they always kind of look slightly embarrassed when they do that from my perspective. But all right, well, here we go. Uh, the fact that they nest on these ledges, that they don't build stick nests, means that they drop their eggs right on the substrate. There's usually less padding than you might find in a bird nest that has sticks and moss and a lot of other things in it. So it's a fairly hard substrate. And we almost had the species go extinct because of the pesticide DDT. DDT was used heavily on crops during the 1950s and 60s, really beginning in the 1940s. It was kind of the magic pesticide, and it was sprayed very commonly on agricultural lands across the United States and across the world. And so when peregrines began disappearing, it was a great mystery as to what was happening. But eventually, scientists traced the declines to DDT. And I like this picture up in the upper left-hand corner, just because it shows how long we've been doing this. This is a picture of some of the materials that we used back in the 1990s when we were working on this. And it's kind of basically almost a kind of hand-drawn typed thing with a bunch of sticky dots on it that we used. We've gotten much more high tech in our ability to design things since we started doing this. But what DDT did was essentially peregrines would eat birds that had eaten food that contained DDT. DDT bioaccumulates. And so songbirds would eat worms and bugs that had DDT in them. That DDT would get stored in those birds' fat tissues. When a peregrine ate that bird, it would get the full load of DDT into its system, and that DDT would bioaccumulate in the peregrine's body. When peregrines laid eggs, they would release that DDT. It takes a lot of energy when they're incubating and raising and laying eggs. That DDT would get released into their system. And what DDT does is that it basically blocks an enzyme necessary for manufacturing calcium. And so peregrines were laying eggs that with very thin eggshells. And as researchers began exploring what was happening, they realized that DDT was causing those eggs to be fragile, and they would lay them and they would break. By the way, Oregon used more DDT than any other state in the United States. So we used a tremendous amount of it. We also manufactured it in the North Reach of the Willamette in Portland Harbor. And so peregrines basically were disappearing from the planet. By 1970, there were no peregrines east of the Mississippi, just a handful in the western United States, and none in Oregon. No nesting peregrines left in Oregon. They had disappeared. It's pretty amazing when you think about it. The Endangered Species Act was signed by the Nixon administration in 1973. And at that time, the peregrines were listed. They were one of the first species listed under the ESA. The Nixon administration also banned DDT in 1972. And it's pretty cool. If you ever read the Endangered Species Act, people tend to focus on the later sections. But you think about the politics of today and the politics then. The Republican administration, the Nixon administration, signed this law that said Congress finds and declares various species of fish and wildlife plants in the United States have been rendered extinct as a consequence of economic growth and development untempered by adequate concern and conservation. So simple, so straightforward. Other species of fish and wildlife plants have been so depleted in numbers that they're in danger of being threatened or extinction. And so this law came into effect. And again, 1972, 1972, DDT is banned. 1973, the Endangered Species Act goes into effect. And at that point, peregrine nest sites became much more protected. Take of peregrine was prohibited. And a bunch of crazy falconers led by Tom Cade at Cornell University decided they were going to recover peregrines. At that point, people didn't know if it was even possible. And what they did was they created the Peregrine Fund, and they started breeding peregrines in captivity. And they used old falconry techniques that have been passed down for generations to do that. They reared them in captivity, and then they released them to the wild. When they were ready to fly, they would put them in boxes on cliffs, and you can see one in this picture here in the Columbia Gorge, and release them out of those boxes once they were habituated to them, put food in that box for them. They'd have somebody stay with the peregrines and go down and put food in through a chute. Peregrines would come back and feed until they instinctually began to hunt on their own. And that was a big part of recovery. Most of the peregrines nest in wild landscapes, but peregrines also do nest in urban landscapes. And so as they began making their recovery, they began moving into urban environments as well as showing up on these historic cliffs. It was interesting because peregrines, we had good records of where peregrines had nested historically, and many of those places were the first places reoccupied by peregrines. Peregrines began showing up in Portland around 1988. And this was a big deal. It made the media. They started showing up on the Lloyd Center towers. And they started trying to attract them to nest there. One of the ways you do that is you create nest boxes for them, give them better substrate than might be there just by happenstance. So they would create these boxes with gravel in them. Despite those efforts, they did not nest in Portland. In 1992, which was the year I started at Portland Audubon, we got a peregrine falcon in this picture. This is Katie Weil, who was the director of the care center at that time. And this bird was shot off a telephone pole in North Portland. This species, incredibly rare, very, very few of them out there, shows up in Portland and gets shot. It was brought to Audubon. We were able to rehabilitate it with the help of Rock Creek Veterinary Clinic and release it back to the wild. But incredibly sad that the species, of which there were so few, shows up and gets shot. Poaching is still a huge, huge problem. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I got involved in peregrines because of this person, and I always want to acknowledge the folks who are our mentors. And this is Jeep Pagel. He was the peregrine specialist for the Forest Service. He now works for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as a raptor specialist. He's the only person that ever had that title. And Jeep was the Pied Piper of peregrine conservation. He went around, did the incredible trainings, got people involved, got people excited, sent people like me, I was at the start of my career, out to survey for peregrines, gave the most amazing presentations. This is a picture of Jeep on Portland's Fremont Bridge. He taught me how to enter nests. In this case, he's entering a nest at the very top of the bridge. The picture on the left is the view from where he's hanging. Amazing individual, drove all over the state of Oregon during nesting season to monitor and ban peregrines and collect samples from nests. He's a guy that would go into nests in the gorge and where there were no trees to tie off to, and nail rebar into the ground and then use that to tie off to and rappel off these huge cliffs. Kind of legendary character who got me and so many other people enthusiastic about this species, taught us how to monitor for them, but also this incredible spokesperson for them who would go out and meet with agencies, with individuals, with companies, and convince them that they needed to do their part to restore this species. And, we've had now 50 years of experience doing this kind of work. But back in the 90s, we were still learning a lot about how you really work with an endangered species. How do you, not just how do you enforce the law, but how do you really build the kind of momentum that you need to recover a species? In 1993, peregrines showed up on the Fremont Bridge in Portland. And again, recall that in 1970, there were no peregrines nesting anywhere in Oregon. We've gone 23 years since that time. They were listed in 1973, so it's 20 years since the listing. And they show up on Portland's Fremont Bridge. And you can see the three places they have nested on the bridge. They've been there in perpetuity. As I said, once peregrines occupy a nest site, they tend to stay there. They'll stay together as a pair. If one of them dies off, they'll attract another bird into that site, but they tend to stay. And so they'll use the same cliffs or the same structures for generations and generations, but they may move around at different ledges. And so they have nested under the bridge, and they've nested at the top of the bridge and a few other locations at this site. This was a really big deal because, again, we've gone more than 20 years since they were listed. None in Oregon in 1970, one at Crater Lake in 1980. And this was Oregon Eyrie. Again, peregrine nest sites are called eyries. This was OE23. This was the 23rd nest site since they began to recover. DDT had then been banned for more than 20 years, but we're making this very, very slow comeback. So it was a big deal when they showed up. This gets us a little bit closer to the Fremont Bridge nest site. You can see they nest on this. Typically, most years they nest here. There's a person sitting right there, and peregrines are sitting right here on top of this plate. And this picture on the right is a little bit closer look at their nest. And basically what they're sitting in is pigeon poop and gravel that have fallen through the cracks in the bridge. This is mom and this is dad, by the way, on this left-hand slide, watching while their young are banded. The way you get into this nest site when you want to band them is you climb down this piece right here, and then you crawl across this I-beam until you get to the nest. So it's a really big deal when they show up. And I got a call at Audubon and was asked if we could keep an eye on them. The basic conversation went like this: you have a ton of volunteers that are willing to show up and take care of injured birds at your care center, clean up poopy cages. How would they like to go out and keep an eye on the fastest bird on the planet? I thought that was a pretty cool idea. I'd been working with Jeep by that time. I knew a little bit about peregrines, and I thought, yeah, this would be pretty fun. This would be pretty exciting. But one of the first conversations we had was we should take the young or the eggs from this site, and we should hack them, move them to a wild nest site, and take them out of the city. And the argument for doing that was that urban environments are very, very hazardous for wildlife. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. And this species was at such risk that we needed to take them out of the urban environment. So have somebody go into the nest, take the eggs or the young, and move them to a wildland nest site. We opposed that at Audubon. We had just come through the spotted owl wars. We had been asking folks to make real changes in their communities. Oregon Wild played a huge role in the spotted owl wars. We were asking these rural communities to make fundamental change. And we felt it was incredibly important that we ask ourselves to do the same thing. If we're going to recover endangered species, urbanites have to be involved in it, and they need to do their part. And so rather than moving the young, we said, we're going to take this on. We're going to really work with the agencies, and we're going to make sure that we do everything we can to protect them and get the public involved, but we don't want them moved. There's other reasons as well. You know, most people are never going to see a spotted owl or a marble murrelet. And I love this quote from Robert Michael Pyle, great Northwest author. What is the extinction of a condor to a child who has never known a wren? You know, we need to think about nature close to home. Most people live in urban environments now. And so we need to make sure that as people grow up, as kids grow up, they have wildlife around them, and they understand that it's partly their responsibility to protect wildlife. It's not just out there beyond our urban landscapes. It's in our backyards, our neighborhoods, on our urban landscapes, on our bridges and our buildings. What can we do to help protect biodiversity? And so we thought that was really important. We also thought that, again, you know, we needed to step into this challenge, that we all have our roles to play. And this is kind of funny. Some of you may remember Wes Cooley. He was a congressman from Eastern Oregon, very, very aggressive right-wing politician who eventually had to leave office because he falsified his military record. But he called out Portland. He said, you know, if this were on a rancher's property, you'd be down there with black jackets and M16 shutting the whole area down. But you'll never enforce the Endangered Species Act in Portland. Well, we wanted to prove him wrong. He wasn't the driver on this. This is after we agreed to work with the agencies to manage these species. But this wasn't the optics we wanted. We wanted the optics of urbanites stepping up and doing their part. And so we worked with Oregon Department of Transportation. And you can imagine the Oregon Department of Transportation was not really excited about the idea of having peregrines on their bridges. because this is an endangered species and they have to manage for them. And this is a picture on the Fremont Bridge of a peregrine in the foreground. I took it from the nest, actually, and an ODOT worker in the background watching the banding. And so we went to them, the agencies, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, Audubon, went to them and said, hey, we want to work with you on this. They were somewhat receptive, but two things really allowed us to move this forward. One was the Federal Endangered Species Act. You don't get to take a pass. And the second was the Oregon Endangered Species Act. And the Oregon Endangered Species Act was passed several years after the Federal Endangered Species Act. It's much more limited. It only applies on public lands, but it does require that the agencies work to develop a management plan for the species and participate in their recovery. And so we were able to invoke the Oregon Endangered Species Act as well as motivation for ODOT to participate and work with ODF and W to protect this species on site. They funded me at Audubon to do a study looking at anthropogenic impacts on peregrine falcons. And as the basis for a management plan, there was still a limited amount of knowledge about how peregrines would react to different kinds of disturbance activities, different kinds of management activities. Again, peregrines pick their nest sites to avoid predators. Typically, peregrines will be fine with whatever is going on when they pick that nest site. If they pick a wildland nest site, that's the baseline. And as long as things don't change dramatically, they won't be disturbed. In an urban nest site, there's a lot going on. What bothers peregrines was when you change things. If you increase the intensity or start creating different kinds of activities, especially in their nest area, that's when they start to really get disturbed. And because this is an endangered species, that can happen. And so for 2 years, we did research looking at different disturbance factors. I was always envious of my wildland peregrine counterparts that got to spend time in the woods. I get to spend a lot of time on railroad tracks. This was what my study area looked like. This is a peregrine learning how to fly under the Fremont Bridge on the ground on a pile of rubble at Ross Island Sand and Gravel. So we started doing a variety of things. First of all, we worked with ODOT to get that management plan, get nest safety zones, and also manage their activities. We work with them every year. We still do this a couple of decades later. We meet with them every year and work with them, and they have biologists on contract that I work with to make sure that we have a plan for every single nest site on bridges so the peregrines are not disturbed by bridge maintenance activities. We also started something called Peregrine Watch. We wanted to get the public really involved and excited about these birds because we knew they were going to have to make some sacrifices in order to help protect them. And we also knew that we wanted them to be engaged with endangered species recovery, that this would help raise awareness of the importance of urban environments and also raise awareness of the Endangered Species Act and help us protect species like the spotted owl, the marbled murrelet, coho, and so on, that people might not see as often. We did it on both sides of the river. The west side of the river was very white collar. You can see that on the left-hand side. The east side is very blue collar, very industrial. And again, this was somewhat fly by night. We used to store all of our equipment at Bridgeport Brew Pub. All of our equipment, our spotting scopes, our binoculars, our signage, our informational materials were stored behind the bar. So my volunteers would go down there, pick up these materials from behind the bar, have a drink, and then go and train people about peregrines. We got incredible turnouts on both sides of the river. One of my favorite stories is this picture. This gentleman got out of his truck to watch peregrines. He's driving a truckload of construction materials. He got out, and one of the things we found was that the employees on the east side, the industrial area, knew a lot about peregrines. And one day we asked them, why do you know so much about these birds? It's really great that you're so interested in them. It turned out the very first year peregrines were on the bridge. One of the youngsters came to the ground, was learning to fly on the ground, and the person who ran this site decided he would walk over and approach the peregrine. And his employees told him, please don't do that. Leave the bird alone. Be cool. But he did it anyways. And so you can imagine this person staring down at this peregrine staring up at him, and mom comes screaming out of the sky at 200 miles an hour and cold clocked him. And so they told us that, quote, any bird that knocks my boss on his ass is okay with me. So these guys were super protective. We really worked well with the industrial folks on the east side of the river, I think in large part because of that incident. We also worked the media pretty heavily. We wanted people to really be aware of it. We saw this as a great opportunity to promote the Endangered Species Act and get people engaged with this incredible species. Even the economic folks got involved. This is a promotion for Portland businesses where they talked about one of the great features of Portland is peregrines on our bridges that you can see. We also took on the role of banding these birds, entering the nests when the young were the right age, and collecting eggshell samples to see if peregrines were still laying eggs with thin eggshells, seeing what they're eating, and putting bands on them so we could track their survival over time. And we did this very, very carefully. We wanted to make sure that we wouldn't disturb them. So we get very specific monitoring chronologies that would allow us to go in when the birds were old enough to thermoregulate, so they wouldn't freeze or get cold or get overheated while their parents left the nest and we entered. And also that they weren't so large that they would be able to jump out. So we get very, very specific chronologies. This is very carefully choreographed. Again, Jeep Pagel was critical in developing the protocols for this and training me on doing them. And I worked with him for many years before I began doing it myself. But ODOT would come out to the bridges with us, and this is tying off on the Fremont Bridge, going over the side and going into the nest. It was interesting. In the early years, I would call up ODOT and I'd say, hey, I want to climb off the Fremont Bridge tomorrow. Can I do that? And they'd say, yeah. Who are you? And I'd say, oh, I'm Bob Salinger from Portland Audubon. And they'd say, what's a peregrine? And I would explain it to them, and they would just come along and let me do it. After 9/11, that became much more difficult. The security became much more intense on these bridges. So we had to go through much more formal processes, but they still have been helping us throughout the years. And again, we work with them every single year to make sure that every bridge peregrines are on is managed appropriately for those birds. Occasionally, we draw the attention of the police as well. Somebody climbing off the side of a bridge and rappelling into a peregrine nest typically draws some interesting phone calls. If you look on the right-hand side, you can see my friend Jeep. He's basically come over the side of the bridge, swung over here, and he's entering a peregrine nest. They nest inside these columns that I'm pointing at. So we rappel in and we put two bands on peregrines. One is a U.S. Fish and Wildlife silver band, which is a unique number that you can really only read if you have it in hand. And the other is a black color band that has white letters or numbers, and they repeat. And you can read them from a distance. With a good spotting scope, you can read them from more than a quarter mile away. And that way we can re-identify birds without having them in hand over time. Parents react differently depending on the nest site. Some parents are very, very aggressive. Other parents are not aggressive at all. Typically, it's the female that's very aggressive. The male will make a lot of noise and then he'll fly and watch from a distance. It's the female that tends to come in and occasionally whack you. This is on the Interstate Bridge, and I'm standing there and the young are to my right, and you can see her coming in. We collect eggshells because the fact is that, even though DDT was banned in 1973, 1972, every single peregrine nest site in the Pacific Northwest still shows eggshell thinning. Not so much that they're failing, but still so much that they're still thinner than pre-DDT. DDT has a long half-life. It lasts a long time. We also manufactured DDT in the North Reach of the Willamette. It's part of the reason it's a Superfund area. And the St. John's Bridge, which now has peregrines on it, has recorded some of the highest levels of DDT in peregrine nests in the Pacific Northwest over the last 20 years. This is an egg that was collected from that site that did not hatch. That's the holy grail, to get an intact egg, because with an intact egg, you can actually really figure out how much DDT is still getting into their systems. We also took on keeping an eye on the youngsters when they fledged. Fledging, again, means taking their first flight. As I mentioned earlier, on wild nest sites, on cliffs, the updrafts keep the young on the nest until they can fly, typically. On bridges, there's a downdraft with cold water moving underneath. The peregrines tend to fall off sometimes before they can fly, and some bridges are worse than others. The Fremont is the worst. They tend to come to the ground at the Fremont and spend several days walking around before they really get airborne. And they can get into all kinds of trouble when that happens. And so we took on the role of making sure that when they were fledging, they were protected. And we would have volunteers down there from dawn to dark in the spring. And that means, sometimes 3:30 in the morning till 10, 11 at night, keeping an eye on these birds and making sure they didn't get into trouble. What do all these pictures have in common? These are all things that peregrines ran into under the Fremont Bridge. We fished them out of the water. We had them hit by cars and we fished them off the highway. We pulled one from in front of an oncoming train. We had a hit and run bicyclist. A peregrine fledged off the nest, disappeared behind a building. And the next thing I saw was somebody coming running over saying, somebody just ran over a peregrine on their bicycle. We had hippies playing bongos under the bridge that were causing disturbance. We had Bill Clinton's motorcade one year actually caused some disturbance on that bridge. The Rose Fleet Parade, I carried around yellow restriction tape, and when there were peregrines on the ground, I would just set this up and rope off areas to keep people away from them. We even had one peregrine fall down a deep hole in the ground that the houseless community was using as a latrine. We've been keeping track of it. It disappeared. I noticed early in the morning when I was looking for it, a number of people using this spot as a latrine. I thought, oh my goodness, maybe that's where it is. And sure enough, when I walked over, it was about 6, 7 feet down. And I wound up having to crawl down there to fish it out. We always tell our volunteers the number one priority is their safety, but sometimes they get a little zealous. This is a storybook about my friend Cindy Humphreys, who took it upon herself to get a peregrine off the Fremont Bridge when it landed on one of the decks and parked her car. She was just driving by, but she was a great volunteer and happened to notice this bird, parked her car in the breakdown lane and got the bird off the road. Not necessarily the protocol we want people to follow, but appreciated nonetheless. And she got memorialized in this book, Falcons in the City by Lisa Manning. Other kinds of adventures as well. The film Pay It Forward was filmed on the St. John's Bridge. St. John's Bridge was our second urban nest site. It was a youngster from the Fremont Bridge that moved there and attracted a mate. They decided that they were going to film a suicide scene for that film. If you've seen Pay It Forward, it was filmed on the St. John's Bridge. And just this scaffold was enough to cause the parents to leave the young and the eggs at the time that were about to hatch. We knew the chronology and they're about to hatch. And they basically were attacking this scaffold. And we actually had to get the movie to move their scaffold to the other end of the bridge. They weren't too happy about it at first. The producer was very, very angry. But I got out my peregrine book, talked about how it was a highly endangered species, how they might cause the young to die if they stayed there. And they agreed to do it. It cost them about $50,000. It turned out to be worth it because the next morning we saw food going into that nest. So we knew the eggs had hatched. And that was the first time we had successful nesting on that bridge. And if they had stayed where they were at, we wouldn't have had that happen. And so that was the kind of outreach that we had to do. Today, we continue to deal with hazards in the urban environment. There was a proposal to put a drone testing facility underneath the St. John's Bridge. And eventually, the Port of Portland, much to their credit, agreed not to do that, in part because birds of prey see these drones as a threat. And so peregrines will come and slam into them and get injured. In fact, there's a whole part of the internet now that you can see where people show drones being attacked by hawks. And it's really sad. People think it's funny, but that's actually disturbance. And those birds can get really badly injured or killed when they hit something with propellers spinning. And so happily, there's a lot of work going in now to controlling drones, especially in areas with high wildlife value. The saddest thing we had to deal with what we call the roller pigeon cases. And that was a situation where pigeon fanciers, people that keep pigeons as pets, homing pigeons and other pigeons, were systematically killing birds of prey. And it was an organized effort across the country. There were arrests made in Oregon, California, and Texas. And this is one of the sites in Oregon, right next to a park where somebody has a goshawk trap. He was eventually convicted. They were trapping hawks and killing them. And one of the things we found out during this investigation was that they killed birds that we raised at Audubon. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But they actually went out and shot peregrines that were raised at Audubon. for release to the wild. And the quote that we found, they were online talking about it. I laughed and I laughed when I heard this story because of all the painstaking measures they took to get these birds to adolescence, and then to simply have someone have take them out was simply bliss. The next line is shoot, shovel, and shut up. These folks were killing upwards of 2,000 birds of prey a year on the West Coast. And one of the things I really appreciate about Oregon Wild is they've done incredible work promoting changes in legislation to address poaching. It's really, really important because it's still a huge problem in this state and nationwide, and the penalties are not severe enough. But in this case, they were killing the peregrines that we were raising for release back to the wild, and thousands of other birds of prey every year. Some really great progress is being made on this issue in Oregon, and you can find out more from Oregon Wild about that. This is our legendary peregrine rescue unit. As I said, literally, we had volunteers out there dawn to dark, sitting, waiting for peregrines to fall from the sky if they wound up in the water, on the roads, in front of railroad trains, hit by bikes, whatever. We had people there. Let's skip that one. As they began to proliferate and make a comeback, we started seeing them on more and more bridges. We also had some on Trojan nuclear power plant. They nested up on one of the platforms about 400 feet up the side. And not too many people have fond memories of Trojan, but I do. It's just incredible to climb up this tower, to do the banding, and get these incredible views of peregrines flying by as you're just against this giant wall of cement. This was actually a pretty productive nest site. This is the gravel that first Jeep Pagel put in for them. This is all a peregrine needs. They couldn't have really laid their eggs on the grading, but they can use that gravel. I had to replace it several years later. I always joke that I lost 2 or 3 inches of height. I used to be 6 feet, but now I'm a lot less than that because I wound up carrying 50 pounds of gravel up the side of this thing on my back. It was supposed to be 25 pounds, but the person that was assisting me didn't hear me correctly, and she put 50 pounds in instead. I got about halfway up. I had a lot of adrenaline as I was climbing and realized, oh my goodness, this is really heavy. I got back down. I said, that seemed heavier than 25 pounds. And she kind of looked at me and said, it wasn't. I was probably the only person that was sad when Trojan nuclear power plant was imploded. In order to protect the peregrines on this site, they actually had to wrap the entire tower. All the railings and all the platforms and the ladders have Mylar tape flapping in the wind to keep peregrines from perching on it, because there was fear that the peregrines would be there and be caught in the implosion. They had me come out and monitor to make sure there were no birds on the tower. So I was actually in the next group of people right behind the people that actually were in the bunker that imploded the tower. Pretty amazing to watch, and no peregrines were harmed in the process. As I mentioned, some peregrines are very aggressive. Other peregrines are calmer when you approach them. ODOT came to us and said, we're going to protect peregrines on bridges, but every so often we have an emergency and we are going to have to disturb them. And in that case, can Audubon take on the role of removing the eggs and taking care of them in captivity? Again, I look back on it now, and we took on this work oftentimes without any funding. Oftentimes we had to make it up as we go. And they had a project where they needed us to do this on, and I agreed to do it. This is approaching a peregrine on eggs. They were going to be working right next to her and would have caused failure. So this bird was very calm, though. I literally had to take the bird eggs out from underneath her to raise them in captivity. It was really sad to do that. It's not what I want to do. But in this case, because of the emergency construction activity, there was no choice. We worked with the Oregon Zoo originally, and we would incubate eggs in captivity. And again, this was only in emergency situations, very, very rare, but we wound up having to do it because more and more peregrines nested on bridges, and there are conflicts that are unavoidable. This is Kelly Walker, who's the zoo's condor expert. Got her start working at Audubon and then moved over to the zoo, and she agreed to help us out with incubating the eggs. And it's just a quick look at some of the eggs. One is hatching and an egg being weighed, a youngster emerging. This is a peregrine, or just a couple of hours old, being weighed. It gives you a sense of how improvised this was. This is a puppet. We don't want them to imprint when we're raising them in captivity. My wife made this out of paper mache for us. So she was our puppet master. They look like little baby dinosaurs when they're small, and we would just hide under the table and feed them through that puppet. And we probably raised about, I don't know, probably about 30 peregrines over the course of several years that had to be removed from bridges. We got the utilities to build us these hack towers out on some of the wildlife refuges. They did this for free, and they did it literally the day we asked them to do it because we needed them right away. And we would put the peregrines in the boxes at the top, get them used to being in there. And then when they were ready to fly, we would open the front and they would emerge, but they would come back for 6 or 7 weeks until they learned how to hunt, which they do instinctually, but not very well. And they would feed on the top of the towers. And we would hire a volunteer to go out there and live with them. And they would stay a healthy distance away every day. They would climb up the tower, put food out for them, and then come back and keep track of them. This is Ken Barron, who is an amazing volunteer who's since passed away with his peregrine watching station and the hack tower in the background. And peregrines do instinctually learn how to hunt on their own. So we'd put 6 or 7 peregrines in the tower and then open the door and support them until they were adept at hunting. We were one of the only folks still doing this on the West Coast. So we got birds from places like Seattle when there were conflicts in Southern California. So we wound up taking birds from all over the West when there were problems. And this is what success looks like in the urban environment. Again, this is a very small piece of the puzzle. This is Portland peregrine nest in 1990, 1994 Fremont, 1999 St. John's with a Fremont youngster that showed up there. 1998, we had 3. 2001, they showed up on the Interstate Bridge and the Abernathy Bridge. And then 2008 on the Interstate 205, so both interstates. So they're quickly populating all of the available bridges. It's interesting that we don't have them on skyscrapers because most cities have them on skyscrapers, but we haven't identified any yet. So really, when I started doing this work, you couldn't find a peregrine in the skies of Portland. Now we have them on virtually every bridge. And because of the banding work we've done, we've been able to track where they go. And so we get reports back that, for example, Fremont, there was one bird that went to the Abernathy Bridge, another that went to two that went to St. John's. One was killed and it was replaced by another Fremont youngster. They've been found in Seattle on bridges and elsewhere. So we've been able to really track how they've moved around because of that banding work. And so today it is a success story. They were delisted federally in 1999 and at the state in 2007. In 2000, they divide peregrine populations into northern North America and southern North America. Basically, the line is through Canada, the 57th parallel. And you can see the growth. Since 2000, we've gone in the southern population from 5,785 to 9,583. That's up from no peregrines. There are just a handful in the western United States and none east of the Mississippi. In the northern part, we've gone from 70,880 to 94,336 since 1999. So again, think about 1970, no peregrines in Oregon, a handful in the western US, and now we have literally thousands. So it's an incredible success story, and they continue to grow. So I want to end, and I know I've gone too long, but a couple of things to consider. First, peregrine recovery was relatively easy. Peregrines had a very simple problem, not an easy problem, but a simple problem, which is DDT. And when they banned it, that allowed them to come back. It's been slow, but we could stop using DDT and the effects would occur very quickly in terms of it disappearing in our environment over time. And that allowed peregrines to come back. It's much, much harder to recover a species like the northern spotted owl in this picture that requires old growth. Once it's gone, it takes hundreds of years to really come back. And so this isn't a species that we can expect to recover quickly. And one of the great complaints about the Endangered Species Act is, well, there haven't been that many species delisted. What we need to judge the Endangered Species Act on is the fact that it's kept so many species from going extinct that would have otherwise. And these problems took a long time to create. In some cases, they're going to take a long time to resolve. Right now, the Endangered Species Act is relatively safe, but there's perpetual pressure on rolling it back, simplifying it, weakening it. And so we always need to be vigilant. This is one of our most powerful, if not our most powerful, wildlife conservation law. I would argue it is our most important conservation law. It is what stops extinction. And we need to be realistic about what it takes to do that. Banning DDT, relatively straightforward. Growing an old growth forest, not so easy. Peregrines are a success story, but our birds are in trouble. We know from a Cornell study that there's almost 3 billion less birds today than there were in 1970 in North America. We know from National Audubon studies that there are 389 species that may go extinct over the next century because of climate change. And so we are having a biodiversity crisis in general, but the impacts on birds are tremendous. And we're going to see a lot more listings going forward. And it's something we need to start to prepare ourselves for and really get our heads around. 25% of our common bird species, not things we think about as endangered or threatened, have more than 50% population declines over the last 40 years. And here we're talking about species like rufous hummingbirds, golden crown kinglets, killdeer, species that we take for granted, but in fact are plummeting. We just aren't aware of it yet, but we will be in the not too near future. And so we really need to think about how we are going to deal with a lot more species on the ESA, and how do we manage in this new dynamic that we're in. We need to recognize that urban environments matter. You know, when I started doing this work, we were writing off urban environments, but 30 years later, we understand that they're important. And we need to start thinking about urban problems and how they affect wildlife. One that we should be thinking about is light pollution. Light pollution and collisions with buildings, and they work synchronistically, kill over 1 billion birds every year. Portland Audubon, my former employer, has a great program to address light pollution and building collisions. And so we need to start thinking about how do we make urban landscapes more habitable for wildlife. I put this picture in because this is Mary. She runs that program. And she also was so inspired by the peregrine work that she did that she actually has a peregrine tattooed on her arm now. That gives you a sense of the dedication of our volunteers. She's staff too at Audubon. Couple more thoughts. One is that the ESA, the state ESA, has untapped potential. No one ever invokes the state ESA until recently with marble murrelets, where the state is supposed to do management plans for all endangered species listed under the State Endangered Species Act and manage for them on state lands. We had to sue the Department of Fish and Wildlife. Oregon Wild was part of that lawsuit to force them to uplist the marble murrelet, which is plummeting as well, to endangered, and to do a management plan for them. There's a whole lot of species that are listed in Oregon that don't have management plans. It's a real opportunity area to advance endangered species protection at a state level. And I wanted to end with this picture. You know, I have been doing this for 30 years. When I started doing peregrine research and advocacy and monitoring, there were no peregrines. I couldn't have taken my kids out to see a peregrine in Portland. They just weren't in our skies. And this is my son, Peter. And right after he was born, pretty much leaving the hospital, I took him out to the St. John's Bridge where there were peregrines hunting overhead, just because it's such an amazing thing. And of all the projects I've worked on, this is the one that really means the most to me, because, you know, there was a time when kids in Portland couldn't have seen the fastest bird in the world, but today they are overhead and we can go out and see them. They're doing well, and hopefully they inspire us to do more for our wild birds, both close by and in our wildest landscapes. So with that, I'll end, and I'm sorry for going too long.
Thank you, Bob. That was excellent, really informative, and all of your pictures are so amazing too. But I'm gonna jump right into some questions, and I know it's 7, so if folks have to go, that's totally fine. This presentation will be recorded, but I'm gonna just jump into a few questions and go from there. So first question is, if both parents of a nest are lost, is it common for another parent to take over the old nest site?
No, if both parents are lost, you tend to lose the nest site. Even if one parent is lost, oftentimes they may attract another one in. And peregrines will fight. So you do have replacement sometimes because a new mate or new uh, peregrine comes in and takes out one of the existing peregrines. They will kill each other. And so that has happened. We've also had situations where we've lost a parent. In one case on the interstate bridge, we lost a parent. The one parent tried to raise the young, but eventually abandoned it. We had a camera on that nest and we were able to track it. We knew it had been abandoned. So when we were pretty much sure that it was hopeless, I went up that bridge. The bridge was out of commission at that time. The staircases were falling down. For those of you that doubt that the interstate bridge is in trouble, the staircases were literally falling down. So they had to lift the bridge up to get me up there. So I rode the lift span up, took the egg, but while I was up there, I created a massive traffic jam that went for like 15 miles. And so they lowered it and left me up there in a windstorm with this egg. So I huddled with it, tried to keep it warm, eventually got brought down after about an hour and a half. And that egg hatched. So we actually got that egg through. It's a pretty cool story. But the answer is no. Usually, if you lose them, they have a pretty hard time. Both parents take care of the young.
Gotcha. Okay. And then do you know by any chance what the survival rates are for the urban versus wild area fledglings? Is it about the same or does it differ drastically?
Urban fledglings tend to do worse. There's more hazards for them. I'm not sure there's very good data right now on them. There hasn't been a lot of peregrine monitoring since they were delisted. We did have to sue the Fish and Wildlife Service, by the way. Under the Endangered Species Act, they are required to monitor for a minimum of 5 years, and they weren't going to do that. And so we did sue them at the time of delisting and force them to do that. But the monitoring has been relatively sporadic. There's a lot of species that are in dire need, so they've shifted focus. But urban peregrines tend to do somewhat worse from the studies that I've seen than wildland peregrines.
Gotcha. And then this person's wondering who they should call first if they see an injured raptor in the city.
If you see an injured raptor in the city, call my old outfit, Portland Audubon's Wildlife Care Center. They're there 365 days a year, and they can help you.
Awesome. I'm just gonna keep going through them. So the next question is, will peregrines typically nest close together, or what is the typical distance? Do they have any overlapping territories?
They're very, very territorial, so they will typically not overlap. And they'll typically patrol their areas. In urban environments, they can nest fairly close together. We had a nest that was less than about 0.6 miles apart from another nest. And it was really interesting to watch those birds because there was almost an invisible line, vertical line into the sky that they would not cross. You would watch them hunting and they would tuck roll and go back the other way. So they would stay apart. So they're super, super territorial.
Okay, interesting. So let's see, is there a nest on the Burnside Bridge, which will be under construction starting in 2027?
There is not.
Okay.
And the Burnside Bridge is relatively low. They tend to be higher up. They tend to want higher ledges, although they could show up on a bridge like that. We've had some low elevation nest sites, but we don't have to worry about that one. But we have dealt with big construction projects. One of the reasons we had to take birds off of bridges was the St. John's Bridge work that went on around 2000 that went on for 3 years, where they literally had the entire bridge wrapped, and the peregrines would still attempt to nest, and we would take the eggs to protect them.
Okay, so normally if there's any maintenance or construction for a bridge, someone will be taking care of the birds.
Yeah,
Okay.
typically if there is construction, we haven't had to do it in a long, long time. I'm still on call for that kind of work. I still work with ODOT every year, and I do it through well, I'm a river keeper now. But we monitor them, keep track of them, work with them on if there's going to be any kind of activity, we try to get outside of nesting season, try to stay out of the restriction zones. If that's not possible, then we make a judgment call. I will say that we're much less likely to take birds today than we were 20 years ago when they were still critically endangered. Every egg truly mattered for the survival of the species. And so we really could not take chances back then. And as they've recovered and there's a lot more of them, we're much more willing to accept, if it's unavoidable, some level of disturbance and hope that they do all right. And so far, for the most part, they have. And so we push the envelope more because we always want them raised by their parents. Their chances of survival are going to be so much higher if they're raised by their parents and taught to hunt by their parents than if they come out of a captive environment. And so that is absolutely a last resort. And as they're doing better and better, we use it less and less often.
Okay. All right, I have 3 more questions for you before I feel like we should wrap up. And one comment. So the one comment is a heartfelt thanks to you, Bob, for all of your work in Portland for all these years. You're an icon and a hero to so many of us. So it seems like a lot of people really appreciate all the work that you've done for peregrines and so many other species. So thank you so much. Wanted to read that comment because it was a nice one.
Well, I just
And
want to flag the
then
volunteers because we had incredible volunteers on this. And, I get the credit a little bit, but we had so many people out there, I mean, who put in hundreds and hundreds of hours, were out there dawn to dark. And so they're the unsung heroes. We did incredible people. And then
yeah,
folks like Jeep who devote his whole life to this. But thank you.
definitely. Yeah, of course. So 3 more questions. So is there any sort of analysis on what the local peregrines most prey on? I know you mentioned pigeons, but if there's anything else on that.
Yeah, we do collect prey remains. I don't go to as many nests as I used to, but we collect prey remains, pigeons, starlings, um, but shorebirds. We get a lot of cedar waxwings, swallows, and occasionally waterfowl feathers. Again, they can take really small species, really big species. So we see a big variety even in the urban landscape. And we have over 200 species that migrate through Portland every year. So there's a lot of biodiversity that follows the river corridors as well. So they have a lot of different options. But as I mentioned, I gave the story about the going into the pigeon nest and actually just pulling pigeons out, not even bothering to hunt for them. It's pretty easy prey. And there are studies that show they don't travel as far for food in urban environments. But we get a wide array of different kinds of food coming out of those nests.
Okay. Next question, second to last. This person's wondering if you're finding any other pesticides in the egg samples or what things you're typically looking for.
We haven't done any analysis from urban nest sites in a long time. Again, most we look at are fragments because they've hatched, and there you can't really do the analysis. You can just look at the thickness. And again, all the testing that's been done in the Pacific Northwest still shows thinning of a greater extent than prior to DDT, even though they're coming back. So once we get these chemicals into the environment, but yeah, they have looked for other things. And, for the birds that nest in the, like on the St. John's Bridge, that's a Superfund site. And there is all kinds of harmful chemicals up there. There's DDT and dieldrin and PCBs and heavy metals and so on. So yeah, you can find a variety of different things. But DDT is the one that really hammered them, along with dieldrin, which was more commonly used in Europe. So that's where the eggshell thinning came from.
Gotcha. Okay, so last question is not related to peregrines, but related to the Elliott State Forest. So if you are not interested and want to just head out, totally fine. But if you want to stick around, I'm going to ask Bob one question about this. So the question is, this person's wondering if you would share your thoughts on the Elliott State Forest now that OSU has backed out of managing the research aspect. What do you see as the upcoming direction here?
I'll try not to go on for another hour.
Yeah.
So I've been involved with the Elliott for a long time. I was part of the lawsuit that over marble merlets, and fought the sale of the Elliott, and then was on the advisory committee that was supposed to create the research forest. And now I'm on the provisional board of that. So I've been involved pretty much continuously for more than a decade. The goal was to create a research forest that had really strong protections for endangered species, really significant areas reserved and protected, but also some clear cutting and some ecological forestry as well. And that was a consensus that a lot of groups came to, that offered the opportunity to move beyond decades and decades of conflict. There are compromises there, but from a conservation perspective, a lot of groups felt that it was a pretty good path forward. OSU removed themselves from that process last week. It was supposed to kind of go to the land board next week and become final. And my hope is that it continues forward. That, I think, is the intent of the state. We don't need OSU. OSU left the process in large part because they wanted to have some very, very large budgets that would have required much more logging than had been agreed to. And to the credit of the state of Oregon, DSL and the land board said, no, we made agreements actually 4 years ago, and everyone is sticking to them. And we're not going to give you more logs so that you can have bigger budgets. You have to live within the agreements you made, just like everybody else. OSU decided to leave. I still think we have the foundation for a good agreement, good stakeholders still at the table, and we can still have a research forest, and OSU can come and use it as a research forest. They don't need to be part of the management structure. And so that's where I'm at right now. I think a lot of other people are as well, but obviously this coming at the very end of the process creates an interesting dynamic. So that's where I stand at this point. OSU was not essential to this moving forward. They actually were mostly going to be doing research and other management activities as assigned by the board, but those kinds of activities can be done by another entity. So I think we have the right structure and the right path.
Awesome. Good to know. Thanks for clarifying that, because I know we have a lot of folks wondering what's happening there. So it is 7:12, time for me to wrap up. But this was great, Bob. Thank you so much for your presentation. I learned so much, and I know our audience did too. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us tonight. And if you want to view this again, a recording will be available pretty soon on our website and be emailed out to everyone. So thank you everyone for joining, and have a great night. Thanks, Bob.
Thank
Bye.
you. I appreciate you having me.